Hi everyone, Ryan Jackson for the Steel Tube Institute. I hope you're having a great day. We decided to do a couple of videos covering conduit fill. Now, that may seem like an easy topic, and perhaps it is, but there's actually a lot of little things that you have to do in order to ensure that you're doing it correctly. So, part one of the video series, which we're doing right now, is going to cover the requirements. All right, so when do you use 40% fill? When can you use 60% fill? When you limit it to 31% fill? What do you do if your conduit's 24 inches long? What are the rules if you're using a conduit, but it's not really for a conduit system, it's just for a sleeve to protect a cable? In fact, what if you have a cable, but it's not a round cable, it's an elliptical cable? How do we treat that cable? So there's a lot more rules than one might initially think, and that's going to be the subject of this video, which is part one. In part two, we're actually going to roll up our sleeves, get our calculators out, our code books, our straight edges, and we're going to punch the numbers and do the actual calculations. But of course, we're not going to do the calculations until we know the rules. So let's go ahead and get our code books out. We're going to go straight into the NEC. Now this is based on the 2023, but being mindful, a lot of this stuff hasn't changed in a long time. So if you have an earlier version of the code book, you should be okay. So let's go ahead and get started right now. All right, so Raceway fill. Part 1, Chapter 9, Table 1, and the table notes. Now, I'm going to be using my slides here, and I just want to clarify really quick because sometimes you're going to see some underlined yellow text, and all that means on a slide is that it's a 2023 code change. So I just like that to kind of jump off the page a little bit clearer so that you know if something changed. I do want to emphasize, though, all NEC text on my slides is paraphrase. I don't just copy the text from the NEC and paste it onto the slide. Number one, it would be a copyright violation. I can't even if I wanted to. But number two, sometimes that's not the easiest way to read it and to learn it. You definitely use the actual code book, but sometimes hearing it described in layman's terms is a little bit easier. So I paraphrase the NEC text. Always be mindful of that fact. So follow along with your code book, read the actual rule. Just remember that my slides, they pretty much tell the story, but they're not word for word from the NEC. All right, let's go ahead and get started. 300.17 is the first rule that we're going to talk about, and that is the number of conductors and cables in a raceway. This is really the first place in the code that we start to talk about raceway fill. 300.17 says this: the number of conductors or cables in a raceway is limited to ensure that they can be installed without damaging their insulation. All right, it's really important to remember that when we're talking about conduit fill, we're just talking about a mechanical function. Okay, we're just talking about how many wires can you put in a conduit without damaging them. This has nothing to do with how many current carrying conductors can be in a conduit or temperature adjustment or correction factors. This has nothing to do with any of that. This is simply how many wires can you put in a conduit without damaging them. All right, so that's what 300.17 has to say. Now here in this photograph, it seems pretty apparent that that's almost certainly a code violation. Now, is that actually a code violation? Yeah, we'll find out a little bit later. I feel pretty good in saying that it is, but you might be surprised. When you actually do the math and you look at what 40% or even 60% looks like, sometimes it's rather surprising. This section has an informational note as well. 300.17 says take a look at the .22 section of the Chapter 3 wiring method rule, because that's where the actual requirements are. So for example, if you have EMT, you would go to 358.22, and that's going to be where you see the rule that actually says EMT must not exceed the fill requirements in Chapter 9, Table 1. So that's where the rules come from. Remember, the Chapter 9 tables, you can't just go to a table. A rule has to tell you to go to a table. And that's true not just with Chapter 9 tables, but with all tables in the NEC. If you're sizing equipment grounding conductor, you can't just jump into table 250.122. You have to read section 250.122 and then get to the table. So the actual rules in the NEC, 300.17 glosses over it, And then it tells you, listen, go to the applicable raceway that you're talking about, EMT, rigid metal conduit, IMC, and go to the .22 section of those articles. That's where the rules are, and those are going to send you to the back of the book in Chapter 9, Table 1. There is kind of an outlier, and that would be for wireways. So here in the photograph, I'm showing a metal wireway. Those have slightly different requirements. Now, you're still going to calculate conduit fill, but I'm just going to tell you really quick, you're limited to 20% fill. If you go to 376.22a, you're limited to 20% fill. And if you do the math, you'll see why you're limited to 20% fill. 20% fill in a wireway is insane. I mean, you can put hundreds of wires in a wireway without actually violating the code. So we're going to stick to circular raceways in this video because in reality, that's when we're going to actually do the calculations. All right, so just so we're kind of on the same page and we have a good starting point here, look at the photograph here. This is a piece of rigid metal conduit, and the red conductors inside that conduit make up 40% fill of the conduit. The blue conductors are 20% fill, and of course, all of the conductors taken together is what 60% fill looks like. So, when you hear that you can fill a raceway to 60% fill if it's 24 inches or less, that's usually a true statement, but maybe not something worth trying to do. That's what 60% fill looks like. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You want to try to fill it to 60%, be my guest, but it would be pretty tough. So 60% fill, very hard to violate, but that is the absolute limit. In reality, 40% fill is usually what we shoot for if the raceway is longer than 24 inches. But that's what Table 9 talks about. So let's go ahead and get into it. Chapter 9 tables. Chapter 9, Table 1. The first thing we read says, Table 1 of Chapter 9 contains the raceway fill requirements. Informational notes are not part of the rules, but table notes are. So I want to kind of emphasize this because the table 1, is actually quite small. But the rest of Chapter 9, Table 1 is all of the notes to the table, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time on. Now, when we're reading through the code and we see an informational note is just information. It's not enforceable. But table notes are enforceable. So don't gloss over the table notes. You have to read the table notes, especially when it comes to conduit fill. All right, so Chapter 9, Table 1 says, look, if you have one conductor in the raceway, let me get out my laser pointer here. If I've got one conductor in the raceway, then I'm limited to 53% fill. If I have two conductors, I'm limited to 31%. If I have more than two conductors, I can go up to 40% fill maximum. And if my raceway is 24 inches or less, I can actually fill it to 60%. Now, here in the graphic, these are based on trade size 1 EMT, so 1 inch EMT. So 1 inch EMT has a total area of 0.864 square inches. So right off the bat, let's remember that we don't really use 1 inch EMT or 1.25 PVC. We use trade size 1 and trade size 2 and trade size 2.5 because trade size 1, is it 1 inch? Well, no, not quite. The internal diameter of trade size 1 is not 1 inch. It's 0.864 when it comes to EMT. So if I say 1 inch instead of trade size 1, and it's just because I'm kind of old school and most of us still say that. So what I've shown here in the graphic is 1 inch EMT, trade size 1 EMT. So the total square inches is 0.864. If I were to put one conductor, I'm allowed to fill that raceway up to 53%. But look at the example and look at what 53% actually looks like right there. 53% is pretty dang full. Human brains are not good at visualizing circles inside of circles. And I know that sounds dumb, but like stage magicians, like Penn and Teller, they actually take advantage of that. And a lot of magician illusions are based on the concept that humans aren't good at catching circles inside of circles. Like our brain just goes haywire when we have to try and look at what it looks like. Believe it or not, okay, 53%, that yellow wire is consuming 53% of the total white space in that raceway, which means there's almost as much white as there is yellow. Looking at that, doesn't that look like it's 75%? It does to me anyway. So it's kind of deceptive. Yeah, we can go up to 53%, but holy smokes, you would not want to pull more than 53% fill in a conduit. Now, when would you have one conductor and only one conductor in a conduit? Not very often. You would have that if you have a grounding electrode conductor, maybe coming out of a transformer and going up to building steel. Maybe you're in a situation like in an industrial setting where that conductor is maybe subject to physical damage and you want to protect it. So you use 1-inch EMT or 1-inch rigid metal conduit or whatever to go from the transformer up to the building steel, and you pull one conductor and only one conductor. What's the fill limitation? 53%. Now that's also going to apply if you're installing a single cable. So if you had like NM cable and you were putting it through a raceway, well, if you pulled a 12-2 cable through that raceway, you're going to treat that as one conductor, and you're going to have to figure out how to, change it from an elliptical cable to a round cable, and we'll do that together. But one cable, one conductor, 53% fill. I'm going to skip 2 for just 1 second, and I want to go to the rules for more than 2 conductors. If I have more than 2 conductors, then I'm allowed to go up to 40% fill. All right, now on the bottom left, I'm showing 40% fill with 3 conductors, and that's what that looks like. And that looks a little bit more sane to me anyway. That looks like 40% to me. 53%, that looks like, 75% to me. This down here, 40%, that kind of looks like 40%. So there's 3 conductors consuming 40% conduit fill. And over here to the right, 40% conduit fill once again, but with 4 conductors taking up 40% of the conduit. If we only have 2 conductors, we're limited to 31%. Now, that's something that I had a hard time wrapping my head around as an apprentice all those years back. I don't want to tell you just how many years ago it was, but it was a lot of them. So I remember trying to understand conduit fill, and it just made no sense. 1 conductor is 53, 3 conductors is 40, and then 2 is 31? Who came up with this? Well, it's actually for good reason. Take a look at the example here. These are to scale. That is 2 conductors consuming 31% of the conduit. But notice how, there's a lot of free space left in that raceway. Nearly 70% is open space. But how much of that would actually be usable? I mean, literally able to be used with only 2 conductors. Because I want you to notice how the 2 conductors, they're almost touching the sides of the conduit. If those 2 wires were much bigger, you'd still have a lot of free space in the conduit. But if you exceeded 31% with 2 conductors, the 2 conductors would be wider than the conduit itself. And you wouldn't even be able to put the wires into the conduit. I mean, you'd smack them into the conduit and they wouldn't fit. So, as weird as it seems, there's good reason that we're limited to 31% if we only have 2 conductors in the raceway. All right, let's keep going. Informational note number 1. These requirements are based on a reasonable raceway length and 360 degrees of bends or less. For some installations, lesser fill should be considered. So looking at the photograph here, that's, a reasonable raceway length, and we've got junction boxes every, 100, 200 feet, whatever is necessary, 360 degrees between bends. That's a reasonable installation. Now, there are some installations that are code compliant, but are almost not reasonable in terms of being able to actually pull wires. One of the places where I teach every year is a ski resort in Salt Lake City, Utah. and they have an underground conduit run that goes up the mountain. And the total vertical rise of that conduit from down here to up there is 1,500 feet. And they change 1,500 feet of elevation. So when they're pulling the wires in, they don't pull the wires in. They feed it from the top, and they have to have like a brake system installed on the reels to make sure the wires don't just take off down the mountain and wipe out who's ever on the bottom. That's not the type of installation that we had in mind when we were setting these rules. So you probably wouldn't want to go 40% fill on that. Right? That's not a reasonable raceway length. Or if you're pulling underground, if you've got a parking lot, if you're pulling 1,000 feet because it's all blacktop asphalt and there's nowhere to put in junction boxes or handhole enclosures, if you're pulling 1,000 feet, maybe you don't want to try and press your luck and pull it at 40% fill. Maybe you want to put 30% or 20%. So it's just a little reminder saying, listen, these are based on, typical normal installations. They're not based on extreme situations. So if you have some sort of an extreme issue, then you probably want to consider lower fill percentages. Informational note number 2. This is a really interesting one. This one talks about the jam ratio, and it says with 3 conductors in a raceway, and you'll notice I put an asterisk here saying 3. Not 2, not 4, not 5, 6, 7, 8, but 3. If you have 3 conductors in a raceway, jamming can occur if the ratio of the inside diameter of the raceway to the diameter of the conductors is between 2.8 and 3.2. Now, I'm not going to go into an actual example of how to do the math. I mean, you can do it. It's shown there on the screen. If you push the pause button, you can see how we got there. But the idea here with the jam ratio is when you're pulling 3 conductors in a conduit, they're probably going to be kind of in a triangle configuration. As you're pulling the wires, you're going to have 2 and then you're going to have 1, right, as they're going through the conduit. Now, the conduit, of course, is going to be a round conduit. And as you're pulling 3 conductors and it's going through a round conduit, everything is fine. But when you bend the conduit 90 degrees, you're going to oval that conduit ever so slightly, right? So it's going to change shape. And when you've got 3 conductors that are the perfect right size, and then you smash that conduit down, the wires are going to flatten out as well, aren't they? So as you make that 90-degree turn, your conductors were stacked in a triangle, and then they flatten out, and they can make it when the conduit is oblong. But once it goes back to perfectly round, they're going to stop. And you'll pull on that thing with your fish tape, and you will not get those wires to budge. That's called the jamming ratio. All right, so you'll want to avoid the jamming ratio. It's possible to jam with 4 conductors, but it's really difficult. Really, this is almost always an issue with 3 conductors and only 3 conductors, again, because of that triangle to flat issue that we can run into. All right, forgetting the informational notes, getting into the actual table notes, and here's where we're going to have some requirements. It says, first of all, Annex C can be used if all the conductors in the raceway, including any equipment grounding conductors, are the same size. All right, so looking at this conduit here, how many 12-gauge wires do I have in that trade size 2 EMT? How many am I allowed to have? Well, fortunately, we have Annex C in the code book, and we can just go right to Annex C if they're all the same size and the same insulation type. Now, in the real world, usually once we get into some larger pulls, we're going to have our circuit conductors, and then oftentimes we'll have a smaller equipment grounding conductor. And if that's the case, you can't use Annex C. But if you're using the conduit as the equipment ground, or if your equipment grounding conductor is the same size as your circuit conductors, then go ahead and use Annex C. It's a really nice, simple way to do it. We'll talk more about Annex C in the next video. Note number 2. Table 1 is for complete installations, not short sections of raceway used for physical protection. All right, so here I've got some NM cable going through this piece of EMT. So this is in an unfinished basement in a house. This is feeding a furnace. So we don't want to just run NM cable down there and, have it subject to physical damage. It would be a code violation, so we need to protect that cable. No way to protect a cable is better than using a steel conduit. I think we're all going to agree with that. So we put in a piece of EMT, we'll run our cable down, perfect. Are we limited to any particular fill percentage on that? Well, no, we're not. Now, just for the sake of discussion, if this was a complete installation, box to box, pulling NM cable through the conduit, we would be limited to what? 53% fill, because that's one cable, one conductor inside of a Raceway. But if all it is just a little sleeve for physical protection, forget doing the math, put the wire in there, not a problem. Note 3. Equipment grounding conductors and bonding jumpers, including bare bonding jumpers or equipment grounds, are calculated based on their actual size. Well, yeah, of course they are. I mean, what else would they be calculated on? But it's actually not quite as simple as that might sound. Here I've got some insulated conductors. But what if the conductors are not insulated? How do you find the actual size of those? Because when you get into Chapter 9 and you get into Table 4 and Table 5 for the conduit and the wires, it doesn't talk about bare conductors. So if you have a bare conductor, what you're going to do is you're going to go into Chapter 9, Table 8 to figure out the size of that conductor. Let's go ahead and open the code book really quick and we'll take a look at how you do that. Okay, I'm going to pull up NFPA link here and I'm going to go into the National Electrical Code. I'm going to go down here to the Chapter 9 tables. I'm going to go to Table 8, which is right here, Conductor Properties. Let's make the table bigger. And before I forget, we're going to pin the headers up here. All right, so we've got our conductors. And then we have our stranding, and that would be right here, the quantity of strands. So if I've got a 12 gauge conductor and it only has one conductor strand, we would call that solid, right? As opposed to stranded 12 gauge, which has 7 strands. And you'll notice here, once we get into the larger sizes of conductors, that they don't even have them in a solid variety. I mean, you're not going to pull solid 2 gauge conductor or a solid, piece of 3/0. So those would be 19 strands or 7 strands. So that's what we're talking about when we get into solid versus stranding. Now, what is the actual area of the conductor? It's important that we remember that we're talking about the area of the conductor. So if I've got 8 gauge solid, the area, the cross-sectional area, is 0.013 square inches. The diameter is 0.128, but that's not a number that we really have a lot of use for. Remember, the diameter is just the width of the conductor. We're concerned about the area of the conductor. So 0.13 inches for 8 gauge solid, 0.017 for 8 gauge stranded. And then again down here, it's all just stranded once we get bigger than 8 gauge. All right, let's go back to the book. So, as we figured out, bare 8 gauge solid, 0.013 square inches. Stranded 8 gauge, 0.017 square inches. So that's how you would figure it out. Go to Chapter 9, Table 8, Conductor Properties, figure out whether you got a solid conductor or a stranded conductor. That's how you're going to figure out the cross-sectional area of a bare conductor, an uninsulated conductor. All right, next note, Table Note 4. Raceways that are 24 inches in length or less, also known as nipples, may be filled to 60% fill, and the ampacity adjustments of 310.15c1 do not apply. All right, so a couple of things right off the bat. Really, this section shouldn't say anything about 310.15c1 because this is conduit fill. This has nothing to do with ampacity adjustments anyway, so they're kind of reminding us here, hey, if you've got a raceway less than 24 inches, don't worry about ampacity adjustment. Well, okay, that's great, but really that's a different subject. I mean, to be perfectly honest, Article 310 tells us about ampacity. Chapter 9 should not even be talking about ampacity. This is strictly a mechanical issue. How many wires can you fit in there? But, having the language here in the code, it doesn't hurt anything, but it doesn't really add anything either. The word nipple here. That's a tough one. I don't really like the code using the phrase nipple because when most people think of a conduit nipple or a pipe nipple, it's something that's straight. You thread the conduit and then it's straight and then you thread the other side. Usually that's what most people would call a pipe nipple or a conduit nipple. But that kind of brings up the question, what if the Raceway is not straight? What if it's a 90-degree piece of conduit? Or what if it's straight and then I bend an offset in it? Is that still a nipple? Yeah. Really all this is Raceway is 24 inches long or less. It doesn't matter if it's straight or bent. Either way, same rules apply. And that rule is you can go ahead and fill it right up to 60%. Note 5. For conductors that are not included in Chapter 9, including multi-conductor cables, the actual dimensions are going to be used. All right, I know that this isn't the clearest picture that you've ever seen, but you can see that the conductor here says PV wire. So here we have a wire type that's not included in Chapter 9. If you go into Chapter 9 and you start looking for conductors, it's THHN and XHHW, and it doesn't say PV wire. So how do you figure out conduit fill if you have a conductor that's not in the code book? Well, the first thing you do before we even do that is you find out if you can legally install it. Okay? Just because you have, copper or aluminum and some non-insulating material over it, that doesn't mean you can put it in a conduit. So first of all, let's make sure you can legally install it. Go to table 310.4 and see if it's actually included in the NEC. If it's not, well, then we probably can't put it in unless it's dual listed as something else. So a lot of times we'll see DLO cable. DLO is not permitted in the NEC. It's not in 310.4. So when you have a piece of DLO cable or DLO conductor, usually it will also be listed as RHH/RHW-2. All right, so first and foremost, find out if this thing is even a permissible type of conduit permissible type of conductor before we go too far. If it is, then go to Chapter 9, Table 4, and if it's not included there and it's permitted to be installed, like PV wire is specifically allowed in Article 690, then use the actual dimensions. Get with the manufacturer, find out what the actual dimensions are. Don't get your tape measure out and try to measure it. You're never going to be that accurate. For conductors that are not included in Chapter 9, like we just said, including multi-conductor cables, the actual dimensions are going to be used. All right, so here we have an example that's somewhat common, and depending on where you live. We've got a house that's got NM cable, and they wanted to sleeve it for mechanical protection. Some people will use PVC, some people will use steel conduit. Of course, steel conduit is going to be better. So a lot of times, though, we'll put these cables through a Raceway, and right off the bat, I can tell you that in most instances, that's a violation. If you go to 312.5, C is in Charlie, 312.5C says, listen, cables have to be secured to the cabinet that they're entering. The cabinet, of course, is the box that the panel board sits in. So can I have conduit and then pull cables through it to go into a cabinet? Generally speaking, no, you cannot. But 312.5C does have an exception. It's a really long exception, and there's a lot of criteria in it, but it does allow you to do it in some conditions. Now, here we've got two cabinets. The one on the left has some conduit that is longer than 24 inches, so you would be limited to 40% fill on those. The cabinet on the right, it looks like those are maybe 18 inches, 20 inches, so you would actually be able to go up to 60% fill on those. So how do you figure that out? Well, you have to use the actual dimensions of the cables. Now, for flat cables, we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. So Note 5 just says, listen, if you've got a weird size conductor or a cable that's not mentioned in the code, use the actual dimensions. Note 6. If different sizes of conductors are installed, conductor sizes from Table 5 or Table 5A are used in conjunction with the Raceway sizes in Table 4. All right, so we're going to cover this a lot more in the second video when we actually do the examples. So we're going to take the actual dimensions of the wire, the dimensions of the conduit, get our calculators, and do the math. Note 7. For conductors with the same size and insulation, or for single conductors or a single cable, calculations that result in a decimal of 0.8 or greater may be counted as one conductor. All right, when you read note 7, if you're like me, you're going to have to read that thing 5 times and scratch your head and kind of look up at the sky and think, what, 0.8? Or, it's kind of counterintuitive. But here's 2 examples that'll make it make sense. I've got 3/4 inch EMT, trade size 3/4 EMT. If we're doing 40% fill, how many 12 gauge wires am I allowed to put in that Raceway? Now, look, I know some of you are going to say, well, just go to Annex C. I agree. Go to Annex C. We've done the math for you. Just go to the Annex. But if we want to calculate it out, what we would do is we would go into the, Chapter 9, Table 4 and 5, get the 40% fill for the conduit, get the sizes of the conductors, and what we would find out is that the 40% fill of the Raceway allows 0.213 square inches of conductors to be inserted. Each 12 gauge THHN is 0.0133 square inches. So I'm going to divide the area of the conduit by the area of the conductor, and that's going to result in 16.01 conductors. So you can put 16.01, which of course means 16. Now if I were to do the same thing with 14 gauge conductors, when we do the math, it allows 21.9 conductors. Well, that would mean 21, right? There's no such thing as 9/10 of a wire, and if you put 22, well, that's more than 21.9, so that would be a violation, right? Well, that's where this table note comes in. It says, listen, if you do the math and it's 0.8 or greater, then go ahead and just round it up and say, close enough. And so instead of 21.9 wires, we can put 22 wires in. So remember this one. This is one that the makers of tests really love to throw in there as a curveball. And if you didn't know that you can do this, you're going to get the question wrong. All right, couple more notes here. Note 8. If bare conductors are allowed, the dimensions for bare conductors may be used in the calculations. All right, so if I'm using a bare conductor, usually that would be an equipment grounding conductor. But there are instances where you can use a bare neutral as well. They're few and far between. If you go to Article 230, and of course it's only for services. So if you go into 230.41, for example, 230.41 says, look, service conductors have to be insulated. Then there's an exception that says, well, sometimes the neutral can be bare. So here in this photograph, I perhaps could have used a bare neutral conductor in those conduits. And if I did, then I could use the actual bare dimensions for the calculation. It makes sense. All right. Note 9. Here's where things can get a little bit tricky. Multi-conductor cables are treated as a single conductor. All right, so if you've got NM cable, for example, I know for a long time, 12.3 and 14.3 cable, they were round. You would buy 12.3 or 14.3 and it was a round cable. So you would just use the actual dimensions and treat it as one conductor. So if you had one round 12.3 or 14.3, you would put it in a conduit and you could fill it using the 53% fill column, right? Because it's one conductor. Now with 12.3 or 14.3, it's a flat cable. So if we keep reading, it says elliptical cables, flat cables, are treated as round based on the major dimension of the ellipse. This is really easy to screw up. Trust me. I know because I've screwed this up. You're going to take the dimensions. So let's take a look at this. Now, in the real world, what you would do is you would go to the manufacturer and you would get the actual dimensions of the cable. All right, you wouldn't measure it out like I've done here in the graphic, but just to show a representation, we measured it, and let's just say that that's 3/8 of an inch. And I know if you squint your eyes, oh, it's not 3/8, it's 7. Let's just call it 3/8. All right. So it's a 3/8 cable. That means I have to treat the width as the overall diameter of the cable in all dimensions. So now it's a 3/8 round conductor. All right, so how do I figure out the area? Because I know the diameter, but that's not what conduit fill is based on. Conduit fill is based on the area, not the diameter. And again, this is where people really screw this up. We need to go from the diameter to the area The calculation for that is pi r squared, right? Pi times radius times radius. The radius of the cable is half the diameter. So I'm going to take my diameter, which is 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to take 3 divided by 8, that's 0.375 inches. And we're going to divide that in half as well, right? So we're going to take half of that. So 0.375 divided by 2 is 0.1875. All right, so pi times that number squared. So pi is 3.14 times 1.75 squared equals 0.1103 square inches. So that's going to be how we calculate that thing out. And just so that we can easily visualize that, that is basically the size of a 3-gauge THHW conductor. So that's how we're going to handle an elliptical cable. We need to change that ellipse into a round conductor, and then use the 53% fill column if we only have one of them in the conduit. So let's use this 12-2 as an example. I've got a complete system of conduit, and I've only got one cable going through it. That means I can use what? The 53% column. You can use one 12-2 in a 1/2 inch EMT. But what if I had two 12-2 conductors, 12-2 cables going through there? Well, now I would be limited to the 40% category for the Raceway fill. And if I had 40%, we would find out that I cannot put two of them in 1/2 inch EMT. In fact, we can't even put two of them in 3/4 EMT. We would have to have trade size 1 EMT. So be really careful when you're putting flat cables through a Raceway. It is really easy to violate the code. These things add up really fast when it comes to conduit fill. The same note also says if we have an assembly of multiple single conductors without an overall covering, that's also not going to be treated as a cable. That's just going to be treated as the individual conductors. All right, so here in the picture, we're showing a reel of what some people would call URD, or underground residential distribution. That's just a slang term, just like calling it triplex or quadruplex is also a slang term. What the code actually calls this stuff is service conductor assembly in Article 338. So if we have this, individual conductors twisted together, no overall wrapping, then just call it 3 conductors, all right? And you're going to base it on the actual insulation type. These are usually listed as RHH/RHW-2, or I'm sorry, USE-2 is what these are usually listed as. So you're going to go into Chapter 9, Table 4, and Table 5 for the conduit, look up USE-2, that's how you're going to do your conduit fill. The last note, 10 notes to Table 1. It says Table 5 is based on the worst case scenario, which is concentric stranding. All right, so when we look up the dimensions of the conductors, conductors come in a couple of different stranding configurations. We have compact, compressed, and concentric. Compact, shown on the right, is, just as its name implies, very compact. There's not a lot of interstitial space between the individual strands. Over here on the left, compact stranding, which we normally use, you can see there's a lot of dead space between those individual conductors. The conductor on the left is going to take up more space than the conductor on the right. It's going to be physically larger. Now that's compressed stranding. Concentric stranding is even bigger than compressed stranding, but not by much. So Table 5 is based on concentric stranding because that's the biggest size that you can get. Now, compressed versus concentric, they're close enough. Just go with the concentric numbers. Don't try to do any math. Just go with that. If you're using compact stranding, though, like this on the right, that's a big enough difference that they actually have their own tables, and that's Table 5A as opposed to Table 5. But again, we'll get more into those specifics in the next video when we do the actual calculations. Speaking of which, it is time to go to the next video. I hope you got something out of this one. Roll up your sleeves, get out your calculators before we get into part 2, and we're going to do some math. I hope to see you then. Thanks, everybody. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and ring the bell.